The fluorescent lights in Catherine Price's corner office cast a surgical glare across the polished mahogany desk. 9:07 on a Tuesday morning in Houston, and the CEO of Whitestone Aerospace had already made her first termination of the week. The maintenance technician stood before her in a faded blue uniform, hands at his sides, a shadow of exhaustion darkening the skin beneath his eyes. Marcus Sullivan was 39 years old and looked every hour of a sleepless night spent in a pediatric emergency room. Catherine slid the manila folder across the desk with 2 fingers, the gesture precise and final. Her voice carried the temperature of polished steel. "You are late, Mr. Sullivan. 7 minutes past your shift start. This company operates on precision, not sentiment. Your emergency, whatever it was, has no bearing on our contract obligations to the Department of Defense." The words landed in the space between them like a gavel. Marcus nodded once, his jaw tight, and reached for the security badge clipped to his chest. The small rectangle of plastic and his employee photo separated from the lanyard with a quiet click. He set it on the desk between them and turned toward the door. Behind him, 12 other technicians and supervisors stood frozen in the administrative bullpen, their eyes trained on computer screens and inventory sheets, unwilling to witness what they couldn't prevent. Marcus Sullivan barely reached the glass double doors of the hangar entrance when the sky outside began to vibrate. The sound started low, a bass rumble that climbed into a shrieking roar. Concrete trembled beneath boot soles. Loose papers on desks lifted and swirled. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a massive Navy Seahawk helicopter descended in a brutal vertical drop, rotors slicing the humid Texas air into a blinding storm of dust and gravel. It touched down hard on the executive parking lot, the skids kissing asphalt with a metallic scream that silenced every conversation in the building. The side door of the Seahawk slid open before the rotors began to spool down. A man in crisp Navy fatigues dropped to the tarmac and sprinted toward the hangar, his boots pounding a rhythm of absolute urgency. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Hayes moved like a missile locked on target, ignoring the Whitestone security guards who scrambled toward him with radios pressed to their mouths and confusion written across their faces. Catherine Price stood in the doorway, one hand still gripping the frame, her mind struggling to reconcile the impossible scene unfolding 30 yards away. The rotor wash hit her like a physical wall, whipping her tailored blazer against her ribs. She stepped forward, rebuilding her composure from the ground up, and raised her voice against the fading thunder of the helicopter. "Commander, this is private property. You cannot land military aircraft here without clearance. I demand an explanation for this intrusion and the name of whoever authorized it." Hayes stopped 3 feet from her. He was 45, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that came from 2 decades of high-stakes decisions made in fractions of seconds. He produced a laminated card from his breast pocket and held it up for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough for her to see the Department of Defense seal and the words "Priority Authority" before letting it drop back into place. His eyes never left the crowd of faces behind her. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Commander Ryan Hayes, U.S. Navy Search and Rescue Coordination. I have priority clearance from the Joint Chiefs to extract essential personnel in a life-critical scenario. This facility is now temporarily under naval jurisdiction. I need the whereabouts of Marcus Sullivan. Immediately." Catherine felt the ground tilt beneath her expensive heel. The name hit her like a fist to the sternum. "Marcus Sullivan? There must be some confusion, Commander. That man was just terminated. He's a low-level maintenance technician, nothing more." She repeated the words with the deliberate weight of someone trying to make reality conform to their understanding of it. Hayes didn't blink. He stared at her with an expression that combined surgical precision and professional contempt in equal measure, the kind of look reserved for obstacles that refuse to recognize their own irrelevance. A low-level technician. The words came out flat, each syllable weighted with disbelief and something close to disgust. Hayes shifted his stance, planting his boots. Ma'am, you just demonstrated a profound failure to assess the personnel under your command. That technician is the single most critical asset in a national security emergency involving hardware your company manufactured. The lives of 4 highly trained naval officers are currently hanging on his specialized knowledge, which you clearly never bothered to evaluate. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a register that carried more menace than any shout. So let me be perfectly clear, Madam CEO. You just fired the only man on this entire coast who can save a flight crew of 4 currently 30 miles offshore. And you just attempted to obstruct a military recovery operation authorized at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Catherine staggered back half a step. The entire administrative floor had gone silent. Supervisors, managers, technicians, everyone who had watched Marcus Sullivan walk away 2 minutes earlier now stood frozen in a tableau of dawning horror. The air tasted like copper and shame. A mid-level manager named Derek Paulson broke from the crowd, his face slick with sweat, a tablet clutched in trembling hands. He pushed through to Catherine's side and began reading from an emergency alert that had just populated his secure inbox. Ma'am, it's a Navy T-45 training jet. Catastrophic anomaly in the secondary flight control system. Code lock. They're running on minimal power and losing hydraulic pressure. Too far out for safe water landing. Standard protocols are failing. Paulson's voice cracked. He looked up from the screen, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from understanding the stakes. The alert specifically names one civilian expert who successfully mitigated this exact system failure during a classified simulation exercise 6 years ago. The expert is listed as Marcus Sullivan. Catherine's mind fractured. She looked back toward the hangar entrance, toward the empty space where the low-level technician had been standing moments before, the man she had dismissed for being 60 seconds past the arbitrary threshold of punctuality. The impossible truth slammed into her with the force of a freight train. The quiet maintenance worker in the faded uniform was a secret weapon, a forgotten genius linked to black operations and national security infrastructure she couldn't begin to comprehend. Marcus had heard the commotion. The helicopter's arrival was impossible to miss, and the specific query for his name carried through the open hangar doors with crystalline clarity. He reappeared at the edge of the tarmac, still wearing the blue uniform that marked him as a recently terminated employee of Whitestone Aerospace. Commander Hayes spotted him instantly. The Navy officer executed a sharp salute, the kind rendered between peers who recognized each other's capability across the divide of rank and circumstance. Marcus Sullivan, by pure instinct, returned the gesture. The movement was crisp, exact, and profoundly military, the reflex of a man who had spent years in service to something larger than himself. In that single, flawless motion, Catherine Price recognized the caliber of the man she had just discarded like faulty equipment. Hayes dropped the formality and closed the distance between them. Mr. Sullivan, you know the protocol. They're losing the secondary loop. Can you work the mitigation remotely from the aircraft? Marcus ignored Catherine. He ignored the stunned crowd of his former colleagues. He ignored the news cameras that were already swarming the perimeter fence, drawn by the spectacle of a military helicopter landing at a civilian defense contractor. His focus had already traveled 300 miles out over the Gulf of Mexico, into the cramped cockpit of a dying aircraft where 4 men fought against physics and failing systems. His only question came out calm, precise, and entirely professional. Are there confirmed injuries? Negative, Hayes replied, his tone shifting to match Marcus's controlled urgency. But they're approaching critical parameters, sir, experiencing wild control surface oscillations. Fuel is limited. We're out of time. Marcus nodded. He didn't ask for his job back. He didn't request a security badge or an apology or permission to re-enter the building he'd been escorted out of 2 minutes prior. He simply moved with a sudden, devastating efficiency that belonged to an entirely different world than the one Catherine Price inhabited. Hayes threw open the Seahawk's side door. Marcus tossed his worn backpack onto the tarmac and climbed into the helicopter, the blue maintenance uniform a strange contrast against the gray military steel surrounding him. The rotors began to spin up again, the sound building from a whine into a deafening roar that drowned out every other noise on the flight line. Catherine could only stand there, pale and shaken, as the man she had fired was claimed by the United States Navy to save lives she hadn't known were at risk. The helicopter lifted off in a tornado of dust and noise, banking hard to the southeast. She stood on the ground, holding Marcus Sullivan's discarded employee badge, the plastic rectangle still warm from his body heat, and felt the foundation of her understanding crack apart beneath her feet. Marcus Sullivan had not always been invisible. The erasure of his past had been intentional, a deliberate act of survival in the aftermath of a tragedy that had reshaped every priority in his life. 5 years ago, he had been Chief Warrant Officer 4, Marcus Sullivan, lead systems engineer for Pacific Fleet Aviation, the man the Navy called when aircraft systems failed in ways that defied standard diagnostic protocols. He had designed the troubleshooting software that governed carrier-based aviation maintenance across 3 fleets. His security clearance had been higher than most officers who outranked him by 3 pay grades. Then Rebecca had gotten sick. The cancer had come fast and vicious, a stage 4 diagnosis that turned their modest home in San Diego into a battlefield of medical appointments and insurance claim denials. Marcus had taken emergency leave, then extended leave, then burned through every hour of saved time he had accumulated over 14 years of service. The Navy had offered him a direct commission to lieutenant commander if he would stay on and accept a shore-based administrative role that would keep him stateside. He had refused. Rebecca needed him present, not stationed at a desk shuffling readiness reports while she fought for her life 200 miles away. When she died on an operating table due to complications during emergency surgery, Marcus had been holding her hand. Jake had been 3 years old, too young to understand why his mother wasn't coming home, old enough to feel the absence like a wound that wouldn't close. The boy had inherited Rebecca's thick, dark hair and her habit of asking questions that cut straight to the uncomfortable truth. Marcus had left the Navy 6 weeks after the funeral. He turned down the commission, declined the retention bonuses, and walked away from a career that had defined him since he was 22 years old. The decision had felt less like a choice and more like an amputation, necessary, permanent, and excruciatingly painful. He had needed work that offered stability and flexibility in equal measure. Jake's asthma had manifested a year after Rebecca's death, the attacks severe and unpredictable enough to send them to the emergency room 4 times in the first 18 months. Marcus couldn't take a job that required travel or unpredictable hours. He couldn't risk being unavailable when his son's airway decided to close up in the middle of the night. Whitestone Aerospace had been hiring maintenance technicians for their Houston facility. The pay was modest but steady. The work was straightforward: avionics diagnostics and repair on retired training aircraft that the company refurbished for foreign military contracts. The job required a security clearance he already held and experience he possessed in quantities that bordered on overqualification. He had listed his Navy service on the application, but hadn't elaborated. The HR department had seen 14 years military experience and honorable discharge and checked the appropriate boxes without digging deeper. Marcus had shown up on his first day, collected his tools and his blue uniform, and disappeared into the background machinery of the company. He fixed what was broken. He kept his head down. He never mentioned that he had designed half the diagnostic systems the company used, or that he could strip and rebuild a flight control computer blindfolded in under 20 minutes. He was simply Marcus Sullivan, badge number 4782, the quiet guy who always left at 3:15 to pick up his kid from school. That morning had started at 4 a.m. with Jake's asthma attack. The boy had woken gasping, his small chest heaving with the effort of pulling air through constricted airways. Marcus had administered the emergency inhaler, counted the seconds, watched his son's lips for signs of cyanosis, and made the call to 911 when the medication didn't bring immediate relief. The ambulance ride had been a blur of flashing lights and paramedic voices calm with professional detachment. 4 hours in the pediatric emergency room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while doctors stabilized Jake's breathing and monitored his oxygen saturation. By 7:30, Jake was breathing normally again, his small body exhausted, his eyes heavy with the sedative they'd administered to calm his respiratory system. Mrs. Rodriguez, their neighbor, a retired teacher in her 70s who had known Rebecca and had adopted Marcus and Jake as her unofficial family, had arrived to sit with the boy so Marcus could make it to work. He had tried to file the emergency leave request through Whitestone's new digital system, but the interface required 3 levels of managerial approval before it would process. The request sat in a queue, awaiting sign-off from a mid-level supervisor too terrified of Catherine Price's new efficiency metrics to approve anything without checking inventory logs first. Marcus had driven to the Whitestone facility knowing he would be late. He had weighed the consequences, a written warning, maybe a demerit on his record, against the impossibility of leaving his 8-year-old son alone in a hospital. The math had been simple. Jake came first. The job would have to accommodate or it wouldn't, and Marcus would find something else. He had arrived at 9:07, 7 minutes past the start of his shift, and walked directly into Catherine Price's decision to make an example of him in front of a dozen witnesses. Catherine Price had not intended to become the villain of her own story. She had spent 20 years climbing a ladder built from brutal competitiveness and strategic ruthlessness, and she had paid for every rung with pieces of herself she could never reclaim. The divorce 3 years ago had been the capstone on a marriage that had disintegrated under the weight of her ambition. Her ex-husband, a venture capitalist who made his living betting on biotech startups, had called her cold, obsessive, and incapable of prioritizing human connection over quarterly earnings. The words had stung because they were partially true. Whitestone's board of directors had hired her 6 months ago with a singular mandate: fix the bleeding. The company had been hemorrhaging money on cost overruns and delayed contracts, its reputation for reliability tarnished by quality control failures that had cost them 2 major Defense Department deals. Catherine had been brought in to cut fat, tighten processes, and restore shareholder confidence. She had done exactly that. The new leave request system was one of her initiatives. It required employees to submit emergency absences through a digital portal that routed approvals through 3 levels of management, each step documented and time-stamped to prevent abuse. The system was designed to catch the workers who called in sick to extend 3-day weekends, not to handle genuine medical emergencies. But Catherine hadn't built exceptions into the workflow. Exceptions created loopholes. Loopholes created inefficiency. Inefficiency was the enemy. She had seen Marcus Sullivan's name on the late arrival log that morning and had made a snap decision. Firing him publicly would send a message to the entire workforce. The new standards were non-negotiable. No one was exempt. It had seemed like good management at the time, the kind of tough decision that separated effective leaders from those too soft to enforce accountability. Now, standing on the tarmac, watching a Navy helicopter disappear into the southern sky, Catherine felt the foundations of that certainty crumble. She had terminated a decorated military engineer for being late to a shift because his son had nearly suffocated in the middle of the night. She had done it without asking a single question about the circumstances, without reviewing his personnel file beyond the surface-level data that confirmed his attendance record, without considering that there might be more to Marcus Sullivan than a badge number and a time clock entry. She turned and walked back into the building, ignoring the stares of the employees who had witnessed the entire exchange. Her heels clicked against the polished concrete floor of the administrative wing. She reached her office and locked the door behind her, then sat down at her desk and pulled up Marcus Sullivan's complete personnel file on her computer. The document that loaded onto her screen was not the profile of a low-level maintenance technician. Chief Warrant Officer 4, Marcus Sullivan, Lead Systems Engineer, Pacific Fleet Aviation, 14 years of service, commendations for technical innovation in diagnostic software architecture, direct contributor to the development of fly-by-wire control systems for carrier-based aircraft, including the T-45 Goshawk trainer currently used by the Navy for advanced jet pilot instruction. Recipient of the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, a non-combat decoration for heroism, awarded for technical decisions made during a high-risk aerial rescue operation in the Persian Gulf. Catherine scrolled down. The file included a promotion offer, a direct commission to lieutenant commander, contingent on his agreement to accept a shore-based assignment at Naval Air Systems Command in Patuxent River, Maryland. Marcus had declined. The discharge paperwork cited personal circumstances requiring immediate family care as the reason for separation. No details, no elaboration, just a bureaucratic phrase that concealed an entire universe of pain. She kept reading. Marcus's technical expertise wasn't limited to diagnostics. He had been instrumental in identifying a critical flaw in the secondary flight control system of the T-45 during the aircraft's initial integration testing. The flaw involved a handoff sequence between the primary fly-by-wire system and the manual override backup, a narrow window during high-G maneuvers where the control surfaces could freeze momentarily if the software encountered a specific sequence of inputs. Marcus had flagged the issue in a formal report 4 years ago. He had recommended a complete redesign of the affected module, a fix that would have required 6 months of development work and delayed the aircraft's deployment by a full fiscal year. Whitestone's executive team at the time, the previous CEO and his leadership council, had rejected the recommendation. They had been 3 months away from delivering the contract and collecting a substantial performance bonus tied to on-time completion. Instead of redesigning the module, they had implemented a software patch that masked the error by rerouting the diagnostic alert into a dummy variable. The system appeared to function correctly during controlled testing, but the underlying flaw remained embedded in the code like a ticking bomb. Catherine's hands began to tremble. She scrolled further, pulling up the internal communications chain tied to Marcus's original report. The emails were clinical and devastating. Marcus had escalated the issue twice, providing detailed simulations that demonstrated the failure mode under real-world stress conditions. The response from the program director had been terse. Cost-benefit analysis does not support delay. Implement workaround and document for post-delivery review. The post-delivery review had never happened. The documentation had been buried in a server archive. The T-45 aircraft equipped with the flawed modules had been delivered to the Navy and integrated into the training fleet. And Marcus Sullivan, the engineer who had tried to prevent the disaster, had left the company 6 months later to work as a low-level technician fixing avionics on airframes that would never leave the ground. Catherine closed the file and sat in silence. The implications crashed over her in waves. If the aircraft currently in distress over the Gulf of Mexico went down, it wouldn't be an accident. It would be corporate negligence bordering on manslaughter. Whitestone had knowingly delivered defective systems to the military, systems that Marcus had warned them about in writing, and they had silenced his concerns with a $50 patch and a threat to his career advancement. And she, Catherine Price, had just fired the one man who knew how to fix it. Her phone began to ring. The caller ID showed the Whitestone board chairman's direct line. She let it go to voicemail. Another call came in immediately, this one from the company's general counsel. Then another from the VP of government contracts. Catherine ignored them all. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the tarmac where the Seahawk had landed 15 minutes earlier. The rotor wash had scattered papers across the parking lot. Security guards were still standing in confused clusters, radios in hand, waiting for orders that wouldn't come. A news van had pulled up to the perimeter gate, its satellite dish already extending toward the sky. Catherine picked up her phone and dialed Marcus Sullivan's cell number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voice on the recording was calm and unremarkable. "You've reached Marcus Sullivan. Leave a message." She ended the call without speaking. What could she possibly say? "I'm sorry I fired you for trying to save your son's life. I'm sorry I didn't bother to read your file before destroying your livelihood. I'm sorry I'm complicit in a cover-up that might kill 4 men." The words felt grotesquely insufficient. Catherine opened her email and began drafting a message to the board of directors. She wrote 3 sentences, deleted them, and started over. The truth was simple, but the consequences were apocalyptic. Whitestone had lied to the Department of Defense. They had falsified safety reports. They had ignored warnings from their own engineer and buried evidence of a critical flaw that was now manifesting exactly as Marcus had predicted it would. If Catherine disclosed the truth, the company would face criminal prosecution, billions in liability, and the permanent loss of every government contract that kept them solvent. If she stayed silent and the aircraft went down, the investigation would uncover the cover-up anyway, and she would go to prison alongside the executives who had made the original decision. She had one narrow path forward: tell the truth, take full responsibility, and pray that Marcus Sullivan could save the 4 pilots before the political fallout arrived. Catherine saved the draft email and stood up. She walked out of her office, through the administrative bullpen where every employee pretended not to watch her, and down the corridor to the conference room where the executive team was undoubtedly gathering to discuss crisis management strategies. She pushed open the door without knocking. 8 senior leaders sat around the table. CFO Thomas Brennan, COO David Park, General Counsel Margaret Keene, and 5 VPS responsible for everything from government relations to supply chain logistics. They all turned to look at her. Brennan spoke first, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Catherine, what the hell just happened out there? We have the Navy landing helicopters on our property, and the media is already running footage. I need to know—" Catherine cut him off. "We have a T-45 in distress over the Gulf. Secondary flight control failure. The exact failure mode that Marcus Sullivan reported 4 years ago. The failure we covered up with a software patch instead of fixing properly." The room went silent. Margaret Keene, the general counsel, closed her eyes and exhaled slowly through her nose. "Tell me you're joking." "I'm not. Marcus identified the flaw during integration testing. He recommended a full redesign. The previous executive team rejected it to avoid delaying the contract. They implemented a workaround that masked the error without fixing it. The documentation is in the archives." Brennan's face went from pale to crimson. "That was before your time, Catherine. You can't be held responsible for decisions made by people who aren't even here anymore." "I'm responsible for what happens next," Catherine replied. "We have 47 aircraft in the active fleet with this system installed. If we don't disclose the flaw immediately, we're complicit in whatever happens to those crews." David Park leaned back in his chair, his expression calculating. "If we disclose, we're admitting liability for a defect that could have killed people. The lawsuits alone will bankrupt us. The DoD will pull every contract. We'll be done." If we don't disclose and someone dies, we'll face criminal charges for obstruction and conspiracy, Margaret Keene said quietly. There's no good option here. Only bad and worse. Catherine looked at each of them in turn. I'm issuing a voluntary safety recall of all T-45 modules effective immediately. I'm cooperating fully with the Navy's investigation, and I'm disclosing the existence of Marcus Sullivan's original report and the decision to implement a patch instead of a fix. Thomas Brennan slammed his hand on the table. You'll destroy this company! I'll save what can be saved, Catherine said. Our reputation, our integrity, maybe our freedom. But I won't sit here and watch 4 men die because we were too cowardly to admit we screwed up. She turned and walked out of the conference room before anyone could argue further. Behind her, she heard the eruption of voices, some angry, some resigned, all trapped in the same impossible calculation of risk and consequence. Catherine returned to her office and opened her laptop. She pulled up the legal compliance portal and began drafting the formal disclosure notice that would go to the Department of Defense, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the Naval Air Systems Command. The document outlined the history of Marcus Sullivan's original report, the decision to implement a workaround, and the current emergency situation that had exposed the flaw's continued existence in the fleet. She wrote carefully, precisely, knowing that every word would be scrutinized by prosecutors and plaintiffs' attorneys. When she finished, she attached Marcus's original technical report and the email chain showing the executive team's decision to override his recommendation. Then she clicked send. The email disappeared into the ether. Catherine sat back in her chair and felt the weight of what she had just done settle onto her shoulders like a yoke. In the next 72 hours, Whitestone's stock price would collapse. Shareholders would file suit. The board would likely move to remove her. The DoD would launch a formal investigation that could result in criminal charges for the executives who had made the original decision to cover up the flaw. But 4 pilots might live. And Marcus Sullivan, the man she had fired for being 7 minutes late, would be the one who saved them. Catherine picked up her phone and tried his number again. This time it didn't even ring. The call went straight to voicemail. Marcus was already in the air, already focused on the only thing that mattered, bringing those men home. She ended the call and whispered to the empty office, I'm sorry, Marcus, for all of it. The words felt hollow. Apologies didn't undo damage. They didn't restore trust or repair the consequences of casual cruelty. But they were all she had. Catherine stood and walked to the window one more time. The sky to the southeast was clear and blue, empty of helicopters. Somewhere out there, over the dark water of the Gulf, Marcus Sullivan was doing what he had always done, solving impossible problems under impossible pressure, because someone's life depended on it. And she, Catherine Price, was left to confront the wreckage of her own certainty. The Seahawk's cabin smelled of hydraulic fluid and salt air. Marcus strapped into the jump seat and pulled the Navy-issue headset over his ears, fingers moving through the familiar ritual without conscious thought. Commander Hayes handed him a ruggedized laptop already displaying telemetry data from the T-45, the numbers scrolling in real time across a black screen edged with crimson warning indicators. Marcus's eyes tracked the cascade of failing parameters with the cold precision of a surgeon reading vitals during a code blue. The jet was dying. Slowly, incrementally, but dying nonetheless. Altitude held steady at 9,000 feet, but the control surface oscillations were growing worse with each passing minute. The pilots were fighting a stick that responded like a living thing, trying to shake them loose. Hydraulic pressure in the secondary system had dropped below minimum operational threshold. The aircraft was eating through its emergency reserves, compensating for failures faster than the backup systems could adapt. Marcus pulled up the diagnostic overlay and felt his stomach tighten. The signature was unmistakable. The exact failure mode he had documented 4 years ago in a report that Whitestone's executives had ignored. The primary fly-by-wire system was attempting to hand control to the manual override during a routine training maneuver, but the handoff sequence contained a ghost in the code. A fractional delay, barely measurable under normal conditions, that multiplied into catastrophic oscillation when the aircraft pulled high G turns. He had warned them. He had shown them the simulations. He had outlined the fix in painstaking detail, and they had chosen profit over safety, deadlines over lives, patching the symptom instead of curing the disease. Hayes leaned over his shoulder, voice crackling through the headset. "What are we looking at, Sullivan?" "Code lock in the secondary control loop. The system's trying to correct a drift that doesn't exist, overcorrecting every input the pilots make. It's a feedback spiral. The more they fight it, the worse it gets." "Can you break it from here?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the module's source code, searching for the specific subroutine that governed the handoff protocol. The screen filled with lines of text, commands and conditionals, and nested loops that represented thousands of hours of engineering labor. Somewhere in that digital architecture was the flaw, the hairline fracture that had widened into a chasm. He found it. Line 2847. A variable assignment that routed error data into a dummy placeholder instead of triggering the fail-safe shutdown. The $50 patch, elegant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its consequences. "I can bypass it, but I need direct comms with the pilots. No relay, no delay. If the timing's off by even 2 seconds, we lose them." Hayes keyed his radio. "Corpus Christi Tower, this is Navy SAR Hawk 7. I need priority channel to T45, call sign Red Hawk 3. Patch us through on secure frequency, authentication code Delta Whiskey 97. The response came back in less than 5 seconds, the tower controller's voice tight with controlled urgency. "Hawk 7, you're patched. Red Hawk 3 is on channel." Marcus adjusted his headset and spoke directly into the pilot's ears. "Red Hawk 3, this is civilian consultant Sullivan. I designed the diagnostic protocols for your flight control system. I know what's wrong, and I know how to fix it. I need you to listen very carefully and do exactly what I tell you, exactly when I tell you. No improvisation, no second guessing. Acknowledge." A voice came back, young and strained, fighting to keep panic out of the syllables. "Sullivan, this is Lieutenant Jason Marks, Red Hawk 3 lead. We acknowledge. Standing by for instructions." Marcus pulled up the telemetry again. The aircraft had 8 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rates, less if the pilots kept fighting the oscillations. He needed to force a system reset that would dump the corrupted handoff sequence and reboot the secondary controls into manual mode. The procedure required the pilots to execute a series of commands that would momentarily surrender all automated stability assistance, leaving them flying a $5 million jet trainer with nothing but raw stick input and throttle control. In smooth air, it would be challenging. In the middle of a control surface oscillation, it would be suicidal. "Red Hawk 3, I'm going to walk you through a forced reboot of your secondary flight control module. It requires you to disengage all automated systems for approximately 15 seconds. During that window, you'll have full manual authority, but zero computer assistance. You'll be hand-flying the aircraft with no stability augmentation. Do you understand what that means?" There was a pause. Marcus could hear the background noise of the cockpit, the whine of the engines, the rattle of something loose in the airframe. the breathing of 4 men who understood they were one mistake away from ejecting into the Gulf. "Understood, Sullivan. We're ready. All right, first step. I need you to input bypass code 4 Delta 9 Alpha into your flight control diagnostic panel. That will unlock the manual override subsystem." Marcus waited, watching the telemetry feed. The code would take approximately 10 seconds to execute if the pilots entered it correctly. He counted silently, watching the seconds tick by on the mission clock displayed in the corner of the laptop screen. The data stream flickered. For a moment, the telemetry went dark, then snapped back online with a new status indicator flashing green. The bypass code had accepted. But the oscillations didn't stop. Marcus felt ice slide down his spine. The code should have worked. It had worked in every simulation he'd run during the original testing phase. The system should have recognized the bypass command and dumped the corrupted handoff routine, clearing the way for a clean manual takeover. Instead, the oscillations intensified. The T-45 dropped 500 feet in 8 seconds. The altitude readout bleeding red as the pilots hauled back on the stick to arrest the descent. Lieutenant Marks's voice came through the headset, no longer calm, the professional veneer cracking under the pressure of imminent death. "Sullivan, it's not working. We're losing altitude fast. The surfaces are going crazy." Hayes gripped Marcus's shoulder. "What the hell happened?" Marcus stared at the screen, mind racing through possibilities. The bypass code had executed correctly. The system logs confirmed it. But the oscillations were worse, not better, which meant the corrupted handoff routine wasn't just present in the original code. It had propagated into the backup systems, spreading like a virus through every redundant layer of the flight control architecture. Whitestone hadn't just patched the symptom. They'd allowed the infection to metastasize. "They modified the code after I left," Marcus heard himself say, the words coming out flat and cold. "The patch I designed was meant for the original system architecture, but they kept tweaking it, optimizing for performance metrics without understanding what they were breaking." He pulled up a secondary diagnostic window and began stripping away layers of code, searching for the new insertion points where the corrupted routine had embedded itself. The T-45 was at 7,800 feet now, descending through a hard deck that would leave the pilots no margin for error. They had maybe 90 seconds before the decision tree collapsed to a single option: eject and pray the rescue swimmers reached them before hypothermia set in. Marcus found the secondary corruption buried 3 levels deep in a subroutine that governed emergency throttle response. Some engineer following orders to squeeze another 0.5% of efficiency out of the system, had duplicated the handoff logic and tied it to the engine management protocol. The fix wasn't as simple as a bypass code anymore. It required a complete manual override of both flight controls and propulsion systems simultaneously. "Red Hawk 3, listen to me. The system's more compromised than I thought. We need to do this differently. I need you to abort the previous sequence and stand by for new instructions." Marks came back immediately, his voice fraying at the edges. "We're at 7,000 feet and dropping. We don't have time for new instructions." "You have exactly enough time if you execute perfectly. Trust me." Marcus glanced at Hayes. The commander's face was stone, but his eyes carried the weight of 4 lives hanging on the competence of a civilian consultant he'd met 10 minutes ago. "Red Hawk 3, I need you to manually disengage your throttle control linkage. There's a red T-handle under the left side of your instrument panel. Pull it straight out until you feel it lock. That will decouple the engines from the automated power management system. Sullivan, if we pull that handle, we lose all automated engine response. We'll be controlling thrust manually during a control surface failure." "I know. Do it anyway. You have 5 seconds." The telemetry feed showed engine power fluctuating wildly as the pilots wrestled with the decision. Then the power curve flattened into a steady line. Manual control, no computer assistance, Just human hands on physical throttles, adjusting fuel flow the way pilots had done it for 70 years before fly-by-wire systems existed. Handle is pulled. We're manual on engines. Good. Now input this sequence into your flight control panel. 4 Delta 9 Alpha Charlie 2. The Charlie 2 suffix will force a hard reset on both primary and secondary control loops simultaneously. You'll lose all flight control for approximately 3 seconds during the reboot. When the system comes back online, you'll have full manual authority. But during those 3 seconds, the aircraft will do whatever physics tells it to do. You need to be wings level, nose slightly up, and holding steady altitude when you execute. Do you understand? Silence. Marcus could hear the pilots conferring in clipped, urgent tones. He couldn't make out the words, but he understood the subtext. 3 seconds of uncontrolled flight at 7,000 feet while fighting oscillating control surfaces was a roll of the dice weighted heavily toward catastrophe. Marks came back on. We understand. Preparing to execute. Wait for my mark. I'm watching your telemetry. I'll time it for a moment when the oscillations are at minimum amplitude. When I say execute, you input the code immediately and then do not touch the controls until the system reboots. Let the aircraft fly itself for those 3 seconds. If you try to correct manually, you'll induce a spin. Marcus watched the oscillation pattern, waiting for the trough between peaks. The control surfaces were swinging through a sine wave of chaos, but there was a rhythm to it, a predictable frequency buried in the noise. He counted the intervals, timing the cycle, waiting for the optimal window. 5 seconds. 4. 3. Execute now. The telemetry feed went dark. For 3 seconds that stretched into subjective hours, Marcus stared at a blank screen while his imagination filled the void with images of a jet tumbling out of the sky, control surfaces locked in random positions, 4 men reaching for ejection handles. Then the data snapped back. Green lights cascaded across the diagnostic panel. Control surface position indicators showed neutral, hydraulic pressure stabilized, engine parameter steady, altitude holding at 6,800 feet. Lieutenant Marks's voice came through the headset, shaking but functional. We have control. Repeat, we have full control. Surfaces responding normally. Jesus Christ, Sullivan. That was close. Hayes exhaled hard, the sound somewhere between relief and residual adrenaline. Marcus allowed himself a single moment of stillness before speaking again. Red Hawk 3, you're not clear yet. Your fuel state is critical. How much do you have left? A pause while the pilots checked their gauges. We're showing 4 minutes at current consumption, maybe less. Corpus Christi is your nearest suitable airfield. Distance? Approximately 6 minutes at best speed. The math was simple and unforgiving. The T-45 would run dry before reaching the runway. The pilots would have 2 options: ditch in the Gulf and hope the water landing didn't kill them, or push for the airfield and risk flaming out on final approach with no power for a go-around. Marcus pulled up a navigation overlay on the laptop screen, calculating distances and fuel burn rates. There was a narrow window. If the pilots climbed to optimize glide ratio and configured the aircraft for minimum drag, they could stretch the fuel by perhaps 30 seconds. Combined with a precision straight-in approach that eliminated any maneuvering, they might make it to the runway threshold with fumes in the tanks. Might. Red Hawk 3, I need you to climb to 10,000 feet immediately and configure for max endurance cruise. Retract speed brakes, set flaps to 0, and pull your throttles back to minimum sustainable power. You're going to fly a high-altitude, low-drag profile for as long as possible, then glide the last 2 miles if you have to. Sullivan, if we flame out short of the field, then you glide it in dead stick. The T-45 has a glide ratio of about 12 to 1. From 10,000 feet, you can cover 20 miles with no engines. Corpus Christi is 6 miles out. The numbers work if you fly it perfectly. Another pause. Marcus could feel the pilots doing their own calculations, weighing the risks of his plan against the certainty of ditching in open water. Roger, climbing to 10,000. Configuring for max endurance. The telemetry showed the T-45 clawing for altitude, trading airspeed for height, building potential energy like a bank account against the moment when the engines quit. Marcus watched the fuel gauge tick down with mechanical indifference. 3 minutes, 2:45, 2:30. Hayes leaned close, voice pitched low so the pilots wouldn't hear. If they flame out at altitude, can they really glide it in? If they're good, if the winds cooperate, if they don't make a single mistake on the approach, that's a lot of ifs. It's what we have. The Seahawk banked southeast, following the T-45's track toward Corpus Christi. Through the helicopter's open door, Marcus could see the coastline appearing on the horizon, a thin brown line separating gray water from pale sky. The weather was deteriorating. Clouds were building in stacked layers, and the wind had picked up, kicking whitecaps across the surface of the Gulf. Not a storm, but enough turbulence to make a dead-stick landing exponentially harder. The T-45 reached 10,000 feet and leveled off. Fuel remaining, 90 seconds. Marcus keyed the radio. Corpus Christi Tower, this is Navy SAR Hawk 7 supporting Red Hawk 3. Be advised, the T-45 is fuel critical and may require emergency dead-stick landing. Request you clear runway 18 and position all crash equipment. The tower controller responded immediately, his professionalism cracking just enough to let urgency bleed through. Hawk 7, runway 18 is clear. Crash crews are standing by. Red Hawk 3 is cleared for straight-in approach, no delay. Winds currently 270 at 18, gusting 25. Marcus relayed the wind information to the pilots. A direct crosswind at nearly 20 knots, gusting higher, enough to push the aircraft off centerline during the final seconds of the approach when precision mattered most. Fuel remaining, 60 seconds. The T-45 began its descent, trading the altitude it had just gained for distance toward the runway. Marcus pulled up the approach chart on the laptop and calculated the optimal glide path. The pilots needed to cross the runway threshold at exactly 200 feet, speed no less than 130 knots, lined up perfectly with the center line. Any deviation, too high, too low, too fast, too slow, would turn the landing into a controlled crash. Fuel remaining, 30 seconds. Red Hawk 3, you're 2 miles from the field. I need you to configure for landing now. Gear down, flaps to full. You're going to feel a lot of drag when the gear extends, so be ready to push the nose down to maintain airspeed. Gear coming down. The telemetry showed the landing gear extending, the additional drag bleeding off 20 knots in the span of 5 seconds. The pilots compensated, lowering the nose, letting gravity do the work that the dying engines could no longer provide. Fuel remaining, 15 seconds. 1 mile, you should have visual on the runway. Visual confirmed, we're lined up. Marcus watched the altitude and airspeed indicators, his mind calculating closure rates and descent angles. The T-45 was dropping through 800 feet, speed holding at 140, sink rate steady at 600 feet per minute. The numbers were good. Not perfect, but good enough. Fuel remaining, 5 seconds. Both engines flamed out simultaneously. The telemetry feed showed fuel pressure dropping to 0, turbine RPM winding down, thrust falling off to nothing. The T-45 became a glider, its fate now governed entirely by the laws of physics and the skill of the pilots. Marcus heard Lieutenant Marks's voice, tight but controlled. "We're dead stick. Committed." The Seahawk circled the airfield at 1,500 feet, close enough for Marcus to see the T-45 through the open door. The jet was a gray speck against the darker gray of the Gulf, growing larger as it descended toward the runway threshold. The landing gear hung beneath the fuselage like the legs of a predatory bird, locked and ready. 500 feet. 400. 3. The wind shear hit at 200 feet, a brutal gust that slammed into the T-45 from the left quarter and shoved it 20 feet right of centerline. Marcus saw the wings dip as the pilots fought to correct, using every ounce of remaining airspeed to wrestle the aircraft back onto the glide path. 100 feet. 50. The runway filled the windscreen. The T-45 crossed the threshold doing 130 knots, 10 knots faster than ideal, but within acceptable margins. The pilots flared, pulling the nose up, bleeding off speed, letting the main gears settle onto the concrete. The wheels touched with a screech of tortured rubber. The pilots deployed the drag chute, the bright orange canopy blossoming behind the tail, hauling the dead aircraft down through 100 knots, 80, 60. And then the T-45 rolled to a stop 1,500 feet down the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles that had been chasing it since touchdown. The canopy popped open. 4 men climbed out onto the wing, their movements stiff but purposeful, alive when the mathematics of fuel and distance had suggested they shouldn't be. Hayes clapped Marcus on the shoulder, the gesture heavy with unspoken gratitude. "You brought them home, Sullivan. Outstanding work." Marcus pulled off the headset and set it on the seat beside him. His hands were shaking, delayed reaction, adrenaline draining out of his system now that the crisis had passed. He thought about Jake, still at home with Mrs. Rodriguez, unaware that his father had just spent 40 minutes preventing 4 deaths. The boy would ask questions later, when the story made the evening news, and Marcus would tell him a simplified version that stripped out the terror and focused on the problem-solving. The Seahawk landed at Corpus Christi Naval Air Station 10 minutes later. Marcus climbed out into bright sunlight and heat that hit like a physical wall after the climate-controlled cabin. A ground crew marshal waved them toward a parking spot near the operations building. Marcus walked across the tarmac, boots scuffing on concrete, still warm from the morning sun, toward the 4 pilots who were standing in a cluster near their aircraft, talking with animation born of relief and residual shock. Lieutenant Marks spotted Marcus and broke away from the group. He was 28, lean and sunburned, with the kind of confidence that came from 6 years of flying high-performance jets, tempered by the fresh memory of nearly dying in one. He extended his hand. "Mr. Sullivan, we owe you our lives." That was the finest piece of remote technical support I've ever witnessed. Marcus shook the offered hand. "You did the hard part, Lieutenant. I just gave you the map." "With all respect, sir, that map was the difference between landing and swimming. Or worse." The other 3 pilots approached, a mix of ranks and experience levels, all sharing the same expression of grateful exhaustion. They introduced themselves, thanked him, asked questions about the technical details of the fix. Marcus answered briefly, keeping his explanations accessible, deflecting their gratitude with the ease of someone uncomfortable being the center of attention. A Navy public affairs officer appeared, flanked by 2 civilian reporters who had somehow gained access to the airfield. The questions started immediately, rapid fire and overlapping. "Mr. Sullivan, can you tell us what happened out there? How did you know how to fix the system? Is it true you used to work for Whitestone Aerospace?" Marcus held up a hand, cutting off the cascade of inquiries. "The aircraft experienced a flight control malfunction. The pilots executed a successful emergency landing. That's the story. Everything else is technical detail that doesn't belong in a news report." The public affairs officer, a lieutenant commander with the polished demeanor of someone trained to manage media crises, stepped forward smoothly. Gentlemen, we'll have a formal statement from Naval Air Systems Command within the hour. For now, I need to ask you to respect operational security and allow the crew to debrief. The reporters withdrew reluctantly, still shouting questions that Marcus ignored. He turned back to Lieutenant Marks. I need to make a phone call. Can you point me towards somewhere quiet? Marks gestured toward the operations building. Second floor, conference room C. Should be empty this time of day. Marcus thanked him and walked toward the building, fishing his phone from his pocket. The screen showed 14 missed calls, 3 from Mrs. Rodriguez, 5 from numbers he didn't recognize, and 6 from Catherine Price. He ignored all of them and dialed Mrs. Rodriguez first. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry, wrapped in forced calm.
Marcus, thank God. We've been watching the news. Are you all right?
I'm fine. How's Jake?
He's good. Breathing normally, no distress. He's been asking where you are. I told him you had to help some people at work.
Marcus closed his eyes and felt the tension in his chest ease fractionally. I'll be home in a few hours. Tell him I'm sorry I couldn't call sooner.
He understands, Marcus. He's a smart boy. He knows you're doing important work.
They spoke for another minute, Miss Rodriguez filling him in on the mundane details of Jake's morning, breakfast, medication, cartoons on the television. The normalcy of it felt surreal after the intensity of the rescue. Marcus thanked her, promised to be home before dinner, and ended the call. Then he stared at the 6 missed calls from Catherine Price. His first instinct was to delete them without listening to the voicemails. She had fired him. Whatever she wanted now was irrelevant to his immediate concerns. But curiosity won out over resentment. He tapped the voicemail icon and held the phone to his ear. Catherine's voice came through, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been shame. Marcus, this is Catherine Price. I need to speak with you about what happened this morning. Please call me back as soon as possible. The second message was more direct. Marcus, I've disclosed the software flaw to the Department of Defense. I sent them your original report and the documentation showing that Whitestone ignored your recommendations. I need you to know that I'm taking full responsibility for the company's failure to act. Please call me. The third message was shorter, quieter. I'm sorry. For all of it. Marcus deleted the voicemails and pocketed the phone. Catherine's apology, sincere or otherwise, didn't change the mathematics of his situation. He was unemployed. He had a son with chronic medical needs and no health insurance. Whitestone's disclosure to the DoD meant there would be an investigation, lawsuits, probably criminal charges for the executives who had buried his report 4 years ago. Marcus would be called to testify, dragged through depositions and court appearances, his expertise weaponized in service of legal battles he wanted no part of. He had done his job. He had saved 4 lives. Now he needed to go home and figure out how to keep the electricity on and Jake's medication stocked while he searched for a new employer willing to hire a 39-year-old ex-Navy engineer with no recent references. A knock on the conference room door interrupted his thoughts. Commander Hayes stood in the doorway, his expression serious. Sullivan, got a minute? Marcus nodded. Hayes entered and closed the door behind him. I just got off the phone with Rear Admiral Sandra Chen at Naval Air Systems Command. She's overseeing the investigation into the T-45 fleet. She wants to meet with you. When? Tomorrow morning. Pentagon. She's flying in from Patuxent River tonight. Marcus felt exhaustion settling into his bones like sediment. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that conversation, Commander. I left the Navy 5 years ago. My clearance is probably expired. Your clearance was never revoked.
just set to inactive status.
And Admiral Chen specifically asked for you by name. She's read your original report on the flight control flaw. She wants your technical expertise for the investigation. What about Whitestone? They're going to have their own engineers providing testimony. Hayes' expression hardened. Whitestone's engineers are suspects in a potential criminal investigation for falsifying safety reports. Admiral Chen wants someone she can trust, someone who tried to stop this disaster before it happened. That's you, Sullivan. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, the reality of the situation crystallizing. The Navy wanted him back, not as active duty, but as a civilian consultant embedded in an investigation that would likely end with indictments and multi-billion-dollar penalties. It was the right thing to do, the necessary thing, but it meant more time away from Jake, more hours spent in conference rooms and courtrooms instead of at school pickups and doctor's appointments. I have a son. He's 8. He has severe asthma. I can't be traveling to Maryland or Washington every week. Admiral Chen is aware of your situation. She's authorized remote work arrangements and flexible scheduling. You'd only need to be physically present for critical briefings and testimony. The rest can be handled via secure video conference. Marcus considered it. The work would pay well. Government consulting rates for someone with his expertise would solve his immediate financial problems. But it would also thrust him back into the world he'd deliberately left behind, the world of classified briefings and Pentagon bureaucracy and decisions that affected thousands of lives. Tell Admiral Chen I'll meet with her, but I'm not making any commitments until I understand the full scope of what she's asking. Hayes nodded. Fair enough. I'll relay that. She'll have someone contact you with travel arrangements. The commander turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, Sullivan, you're the best damn engineer I've ever worked with. The Navy was lucky to have you. We're lucky you were willing to help today. Just doing what needed to be done. Hayes smiled faintly. That's what makes you valuable. Most people can't tell the difference between what needs to be done and what's convenient to do. You can. He left, closing the door behind him. Marcus stood alone in the conference room, staring out the window at the tarmac where the T-45 sat surrounded by maintenance crews and investigators. The aircraft looked small and fragile in the harsh Texas sunlight, its survival a testament to engineering margins and pilot skill, and the intervention of a fired maintenance technician who happened to know where the bodies were buried in the code. His phone buzzed, a text message from Catherine Price. Please let me apologize in person. I owe you that much. Marcus typed a response, deleted it, typed another. I'm not ready for that conversation. He hit send and powered off the phone. Whatever Catherine Price needed to say could wait. Right now, he needed to get back to Houston, back to the small house where Jake was waiting, back to the life he had built from the wreckage of the one he'd lost. The Navy could have him for an investigation. They could have his expertise, his testimony, his technical knowledge. But they couldn't have the hours between 3:15 and 8 p.m., the sacred window when he picked Jake up from school, helped with homework, made dinner, and reminded his son that no matter what chaos erupted in the adult world, someone would always be there when he needed them. That promise was the only one Marcus would never break. 3 days passed before Catherine Price gathered the courage to drive to Marcus Sullivan's house. The address came from his personnel file, a modest 2-bedroom rental in a quiet neighborhood 15 miles northwest of the Whitestone facility. She arrived at 9:47 on a Friday evening, later than she'd intended, the delay caused by a board meeting that had stretched past 6 hours as the directors debated whether to force her resignation. The vote had been close, 5-3 in her favor, but the margin felt like a stay of execution rather than vindication. Whitestone's stock had cratered 28% in 72 hours. 3 major shareholders had filed suit alleging breach of fiduciary duty. The DoD had suspended 2 pending contracts worth $800 million, pending the outcome of the investigation. Catherine's decision to disclose the software flaw had saved the company from criminal conspiracy charges, but it had also exposed them to civil liability that could drain every dollar from the corporate treasury. The house where Marcus lived sat back from the street behind a chain-link fence that needed paint. A single porch light illuminated the front steps. Through the window, Catherine could see warm yellow light and movement, a small figure passing through the living room. Jake. She recognized him from the brief moment in the white stone hangar when the boy's father had been standing in her office, accepting termination with the quiet dignity of someone too exhausted to fight. Catherine sat in her car for 5 minutes, rehearsing what she would say, discarding every opening line as inadequate. How did you apologize for casual cruelty? How did you ask forgiveness from someone whose life you'd tried to destroy because he'd prioritized his child over your deadline? Finally, she forced herself out of the vehicle and walked to the front door. She knocked twice, the sound sharp in the evening stillness. Jake opened the door. He wore pajamas printed with cartoon spacecraft and held a book about fighter jets in one small hand. His eyes widened with recognition. "You're the lady who fired my dad." Catherine knelt, bringing herself to his eye level, letting the boy see her face without the barrier of height and adult authority. "Yes, I am. And I came to tell you that I made a terrible mistake. I owe your father an apology I can never fully give, but I wanted him to hear it from me in person." Jake studied her with the unnervingly direct gaze of a child who'd learned early that adults lied more often than they told the truth. After a moment, he nodded. "Okay. He's in the kitchen. You can come in." The boy stepped aside. Catherine entered a home that was clean but worn, furnished with second-hand pieces that had seen better decades. The walls held framed photos, Marcus in his Navy uniform receiving a medal, a woman with dark hair holding an infant wrapped in a hospital blanket, Jake as a toddler on a swing set. The woman appeared in several photos, always smiling, always touching Marcus or Jake with easy affection. Rebecca. The wife who died 5 years ago and left Marcus to navigate single fatherhood alone. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, surprise registering on his face before settling into something more guarded. "Ms. Price." "I'm sorry to come unannounced. I wanted to speak with you, if you're willing." He glanced at Jake, who had returned to the couch with his book, then gestured toward the kitchen table. "We can talk here." They sat across from each other in mismatched chairs. Marcus poured coffee from a pot that looked older than Jake, sliding a chipped mug across the table. Catherine wrapped her hands around it, grateful for something to hold. "I fired you without asking a single question about why you were late. I saw a policy violation and I made an example of you because I thought it would send a message about accountability. I was wrong. Profoundly, inexcusably wrong." Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. "I've spent 3 days reviewing what happened 4 years ago. I read your original report on the T-45 flight control flaw. I read the emails where you escalated the issue to the program director. I saw how the previous executive team ignored your warnings and implemented a patch instead of a fix." She paused, the weight of what came next pressing down on her lungs. "You tried to prevent this disaster. You did everything right. And they buried your work because it was inconvenient. Then I fired you for being 7 minutes late because your son almost died in the middle of the night." The words hung in the air between them. Marcus took a sip of coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "Why are you here, Miss Price?"
Because I want to offer you your job back. Not as a maintenance technician, as Chief Safety and Systems Architect, reporting directly to me. Full authority to audit every system we build, with the power to halt any program you deem unsafe.
6-figure salary, comprehensive health benefits for you and Jake, and flexible scheduling that lets you prioritize your son. Marcus set down his mug carefully. That's generous, but it doesn't answer my question. Why are you here? You could have made that offer over the phone. Catherine looked down at her coffee, seeing her reflection distorted in the dark surface. Because I need to understand something. You protected Whitestone today. You could have told the Navy investigators on the spot that we'd buried your report, that we'd knowingly delivered faulty systems. You could have destroyed the company in a single press conference. But you didn't. Why? Marcus leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Because the people who made that decision 4 years ago don't work there anymore. The engineers on the floor, the technicians, the support staff, they're just trying to make a living and support their families. They didn't know about the cover-up. Destroying the company would have punished them for crimes they didn't commit. He met her eyes directly. You want to know what I learned in 14 years in the Navy? That good leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room or the most ruthless. It's about protecting the people who depend on you, even when they'll never know you did it. Catherine felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure opening in the armor she'd spent 2 decades building. I don't deserve your protection. No, but your employees do. And they deserve a leader who's learned from her mistakes. The statement carried no judgment, just a factual observation delivered with the same calm precision he'd used to guide 4 pilots through an emergency landing. Catherine found herself envying that quality, the ability to see past emotion to the core of what mattered. The job offer stands, but I have conditions beyond the title and salary. Marcus nodded for her to continue. I need to be able to pick Jake up from school every day at 3:15, no exceptions. If there's a meeting, a briefing, a crisis, it doesn't matter. I leave at 3. Done. And I need flexible scheduling for medical appointments and emergencies. Jake's asthma is unpredictable. I can't have another situation where bureaucracy keeps me from being there when he needs me. We'll implement a company-wide policy. Family emergencies get immediate approval. No layers, no delay. And the salary. I want it structured as a trust fund for Jake's medical care and education. Guaranteed security that survives me if something happens. Catherine pulled out her phone and opened a note-taking app, typing as he spoke. Anything else? Marcus hesitated, then spoke with the careful deliberation of someone choosing words that would define the boundaries of a relationship. I want one more thing. I want Whitestone to establish a scholarship program for children of military families. $5 million annually, administered by an independent foundation, named after my wife, Rebecca Sullivan. The request caught Catherine off guard. She'd expected salary negotiations, benefit discussions, maybe demands related to his role and authority. Instead, Marcus was asking for something that would help strangers, using his leverage to create a legacy for a woman who'd never know it existed. I'll present it to the board Monday morning. They'll approve it. And I want a mentorship program pairing our engineers with veterans transitioning to civilian work. We hire a minimum of 50 veterans per year, give them real jobs with real career paths, not token positions. Catherine kept typing. Anything else? That's it. If you agree to those terms, I'll come back. She looked up from her phone. I agree to all of it. Can you start Monday? Marcus shook his head. Tuesday. I have a meeting at the Pentagon Monday morning. Admiral Chen wants me to consult on the fleet-wide investigation. The Navy wants you back. As a contractor, not active duty, I'll work with them remotely,
testify when needed, but I'm not leaving Houston. Jake needs stability more than I need a uniform. Catherine saved her notes and pocketed the phone. She stood, extending her hand across the table. Marcus rose and shook it, the gesture formal and final. Thank you, Marcus, for the second chance you didn't have to give me. Don't thank me. Earn it. The words were delivered without rancor, but with absolute clarity. Catherine had been granted an opportunity to prove that her transformation was genuine, not performance art designed to salvage her career. The measurement would be in actions, not apologies. She turned to leave, then paused at the kitchen door. One more thing. The board asked me this afternoon if I thought you'd come back. I told them I didn't know, but that if you did, it would mean you believed Whitestone could be better than its worst moments. Was I right? Marcus considered the question, his gaze drifting toward the living room where Jake had fallen asleep on the couch, the book about fighter jets still open on his chest. I believe people can be better than their worst moments. Companies are just collections of people. So yes, you were right. Catherine nodded and let herself out. She drove back toward Houston in silence, the radio off, alone with the magnitude of what she'd set in motion. Bringing Marcus back would send a signal to the workforce that competence and integrity mattered more than political maneuvering. But it would also mean surrendering a degree of control she'd never given to anyone in her professional life. Marcus would have the authority to overrule her, to halt projects she championed, to force decisions that damaged quarterly earnings in service of long-term safety. That was the price of trust. And after 3 days of watching Whitestone's reputation hemorrhage in real time, Catherine understood that trust was the only currency that mattered. The Pentagon meeting took place in a windowless conference room on the 3rd floor of the E-Ring, the outermost corridor of the massive, 5-sided structure that housed the Department of Defense leadership. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early, cleared security, and waited in a lobby decorated with black and white photographs of aircraft carriers and strategic bombers. At exactly 0800, a Navy lieutenant appeared and escorted him through corridors that smelled of fresh paint and institutional coffee. Rear Admiral Sandra Chen was 52, compact and precise, with a kind of presence that made junior officers stand straighter without her saying a word. She'd spent 30 years in naval aviation, flying F/A-18s off carriers before transitioning to acquisition and program management. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp with the intelligence of someone who'd survived Pentagon politics without compromising her principles. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for coming. I've read your file. Impressive career. The Navy's loss when you separated. I had priorities that didn't fit with active duty, ma'am. Your son. I understand. Take a seat. The conference table seated 12. Only 4 chairs were occupied. Admiral Chen, Marcus, a DoD General Counsel named James Kozlowski, and a woman Chen introduced as Dr. Patricia Vance, lead engineer at Naval Air Systems Command. A stack of classified folders sat in the center of the table, each marked with red cover sheets indicating their security status. Chen opened the meeting without preamble. We've completed preliminary analysis of the T-45 fleet. Your assessment was correct. The secondary flight control flaw exists in all 47 aircraft currently equipped with Whitestone modules. We found evidence of 12 previous incidents over the past 18 months. Control anomalies that were attributed to pilot error or environmental factors. They weren't. She slid a folder across the table. Marcus opened it to find incident reports, maintenance logs, and telemetry data from the dozen flights where pilots had experienced unexplained control surface oscillations. Each incident had been investigated, documented, and filed away with explanations that attributed the problem to everything except the actual cause. We missed it, Chen continued, her voice carrying the weight of institutional failure. Our engineers, our test pilots, our safety review boards, Everyone missed it because Whitestone told us it was fixed, and we believed them. Kozlowski, the DoD lawyer, cleared his throat. Mr. Sullivan, we need to establish timeline and culpability. You filed a formal report with Whitestone 4 years ago, identifying this exact flaw. You recommended a complete redesign of the affected module. What happened next? Marcus walked them through the sequence: his initial discovery during integration testing, the formal report submitted to the program director, the recommendation for a 6-month delay to implement proper fixes, and the executive decision to override his technical judgment in favor of a software patch that masked symptoms without addressing root causes. Did you report this to the Navy at the time? Yes. I submitted a copy of my findings to the program office through the contractor reporting channel. I was told Whitestone would handle the remediation and provide documentation when the fix was complete. Dr. Vance leaned forward, her expression tight. We have that report in our archives. Whitestone submitted a corrective action plan claiming they'd implemented your recommended fixes. The documentation showed successful test results. We approved it and closed the issue. The test results were fabricated, Marcus replied, keeping his voice level. They ran the tests with the patch in place, which made the system appear functional under controlled conditions, but the underlying flaw remained in the code. Kozlowski made notes on a legal pad, his pen scratching across paper with mechanical precision. Did you know at the time that Whitestone had falsified the test data? No. I left the company 6 months after submitting my report. I assumed the work had been done properly. Why did you leave? Marcus met the lawyer's eyes. My wife died. My son needed me more than Whitestone did. The room went quiet. Chen broke the silence. Mr. Sullivan, we need your help investigating this. Not just the technical aspects. We have engineers who can reverse engineer the code. We need someone who understands how this kind of institutional failure happens and how to prevent it from happening again. You want me to consult on safety protocols? More than that. We want you to help us redesign the entire contractor oversight framework. You're someone who tried to do the right thing and got ignored. That makes you uniquely qualified to identify where the system broke down. Marcus considered the scope of what she was describing. It wasn't a 6-month contract reviewing code. It was years of work building new processes, training Navy engineers to ask harder questions, creating accountability mechanisms that couldn't be circumvented by companies desperate to meet deadlines. I have conditions. Chen smiled faintly. I expected you would. Let's hear them. All work has to be remote except for critical meetings. I'm based in Houston, and I'm not relocating. My son's medical needs require stability. Acceptable. Secure video conferencing can handle most collaboration. I need flexible scheduling. If my son has a medical emergency, I drop everything. No exceptions. Understood. We'll build that into the contract. And I want authority to escalate safety concerns directly to you, bypassing program offices and acquisition bureaucracy. If I find something wrong, you need to hear about it immediately. Chen didn't hesitate. Done. Anything else? Marcus thought about the offer Catherine had made 3 days ago. The job at Whitestone, with its salary and benefits and promise of redemption. The Navy work would run parallel to that. 2 separate streams of responsibility that would consume every hour he wasn't spending with Jake. It was sustainable if he was ruthless about boundaries, impossible if he let either commitment bleed into family time. I need the contract to specify that I'm unavailable between 1,500 and 2,000 hours daily. Those hours are non-negotiable. Kozlowski raised an eyebrow. That's a significant restriction for someone in a consulting role. That's my price. If it's not acceptable, we can end this conversation now. Chen held up a hand, forestalling the lawyer's objection. Mr. Sullivan, Can I ask why those specific hours? I pick my son up from school at 15:15. We have dinner together, I help with homework, we spend time together. Those hours are the promise I made to him when his mother died. I don't break promises to my son. The Admiral studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. I have 3 kids. 2 of them barely remember me from their childhood because I was too busy being a naval officer to be a parent. I respect your priorities, Mr. Sullivan. We'll structure the contract around your requirements. She turned to Kozlowski. Make it happen. The lawyer nodded, making notes. Chen stood, signaling the meeting's conclusion. We'll have paperwork ready by end of business tomorrow. Welcome aboard, Mr. Sullivan. Off the record, the Navy needs more people who know the difference between what's important and what's urgent. Marcus shook her hand and left the Pentagon carrying a folder full of classified material and the weight of 2 separate commitments that would define the next several years of his life. He caught a flight back to Houston that afternoon, landing at Bush Intercontinental at 17:30, too late to pick Jake up from the after-school program, but early enough to make dinner. Mrs. Rodriguez met him at the door with Jake in tow, the boy's backpack dragging on the ground behind him. How was Washington? Productive. Thank you for watching him. Always a pleasure. He's been talking about you all day. Wants to know if you saw the president. Marcus knelt and pulled Jake into a hug, feeling the boy's small arms wrap around his neck. Did you see him, Dad? No, buddy. Different building. The president works in the White House. I was at the Pentagon. What's the Pentagon? It's where the military plans how to keep people safe. I'm going to help them make sure airplanes work properly. Jake pulled back, his expression serious. Like the airplane you fixed the other day? Exactly like that. Are you going back to being in the Navy? Marcus smoothed his son's hair, the gesture automatic. No, I'm staying here with you. I'm just helping them from Houston. I'll still pick you up from school every day. Relief washed across Jake's face, visible and raw. The boy had lost his mother 5 years ago. The thought of losing daily contact with his father, even to something as abstract as a job, was enough to trigger the primal fear that lived in children who'd experienced loss too young. Promise? Promise. They spent the evening in comfortable routine. Dinner, homework, a chapter from the book about fighter jets. Marcus tucked Jake into bed at 2000 sharp, listened to the boy's breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep, and then retreated to the kitchen table with his laptop. The classified material from the Pentagon meeting couldn't leave the secure facility, but Marcus had taken extensive notes on unclassified aspects of the investigation. He opened a document and began outlining a framework for contractor oversight that would make it harder for companies to bury safety concerns. The work was technical and tedious, requiring him to think through failure modes and accountability mechanisms, but it had the virtue of being solvable. Unlike grief, unlike asthma, unlike the uncertainty of single parenthood, this was a problem with defined parameters and achievable solutions. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Price. Board approved everything. Scholarship fund, veteran hiring program, all of it. See you Tuesday? Marcus typed a response. Tuesday, 0800. He set the phone aside and returned to his outline, working until midnight before exhaustion finally forced him to stop. Tomorrow he would take Jake to the doctor for a routine checkup, spend the afternoon at the park if the boy's breathing held steady, maybe grill burgers for dinner. The ordinary tasks of fatherhood that anchored him when the larger world threatened to become overwhelming. Marcus Sullivan had saved 4 lives, exposed corporate corruption, and accepted 2 separate roles that would consume thousands of hours over the next several years. But the achievement he measured himself against had nothing to do with airplanes or investigations or career advancement. It was simpler and harder. Being present when Jake needed him, keeping promises, choosing love over ambition every single time the choice presented itself. Everything else was just engineering. Tuesday morning arrived with cloudless skies and humidity thick enough to taste. Marcus drove to Whitestone Aerospace in the pre-dawn darkness, arriving at the facility gate at 07:45.
The security guard checked his credentials, a new badge Catherine had arranged, listing his title as Chief Safety and Systems Architect, and waved him through. The executive wing was quiet. Marcus found his new office on the 3rd floor, a corner space with windows overlooking the flight line where retired aircraft sat in various stages of refurbishment. The furniture was new, the computer equipment current, the walls bare except for a framed copy of the company's safety policy that someone had hung with bureaucratic optimism. Catherine appeared in the doorway at 07:58, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this." Marcus accepted the cup and gestured to the empty office. "Feels strange being up here instead of on the floor." "You'll get used to it. Or you won't. Either way, your value isn't in where you sit. It's in what you prevent." She handed him a folder thick with documentation. "Complete audit access to every program we're running. Safety review authority over all government contracts. Direct reporting line to me and the board. You're empowered to halt any project if you identify safety concerns. No appeals, no overrides." Marcus flipped through the folder, scanning organizational charts and policy documents. "This is going to make me extremely unpopular with program managers." "Good. Popularity is a luxury we can't afford. I need someone willing to stop disasters before they happen, not someone worried about making friends." She sat in one of the visitor chairs, her posture less rigid than it had been a week ago, some of the armor stripped away by crisis. "The board wants regular updates on your findings, monthly reports, quarterly presentations. They're terrified of another T-45 situation." "They should be. We got lucky this time. 4 pilots who flew perfectly, weather that held, fuel that stretched just far enough. Next time, we might not be lucky." "That's why you're here, to make sure there isn't a next time." Marcus set down the folder. "I'm going to find things you don't want to find. Shortcuts, cost overruns disguised as efficiency measures, testing protocols that look rigorous on paper but miss critical failure modes. When I do, I'm going to report them, even if it costs the company money, even if it damages relationships with clients. Are you prepared for that?" Catherine met his gaze without flinching. "If I wasn't prepared for it, I wouldn't have hired you. Do what needs to be done, Marcus. I'll handle the consequences." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. The scholarship fund launches next month. First class of recipients will be 15 students, children of active duty and veteran families. The foundation wants you to speak at the award ceremony." "Are you willing?" Marcus thought about Rebecca, who'd never meet the students whose education would be funded in her name, who'd never know that her husband had turned personal tragedy into something that would outlive them both. "I'll speak, but keep it brief. I'm not good at public events." "Noted. Ceremony is scheduled for 1500 on the 23rd. That gives you time to pick up Jake first." Catherine left him alone in the office that represented his resurrection from obscurity. Marcus spent the morning reviewing program files, flagging items that required deeper investigation, building a list of engineers he wanted to interview about testing protocols and safety culture. The work was familiar, not identical to what he'd done in the Navy, but close enough that muscle memory carried him through the learning curve. At 14:45, he saved his files and shut down his computer. By 1500, he
He was in his car, heading toward Jake's school.
He arrived at 1512, parked in the pickup lane, and watched the doors for his son's small figure. Jake emerged at 15:15 exactly, backpack bouncing, talking animatedly with another boy about something that involved hand gestures mimicking explosions. He spotted Marcus's car and sprinted over, yanking open the door and climbing into the back seat with the kind of energy only 8-year-olds possessed.
Dad, we learned about the solar system today. Did you know Jupiter has 79 moons?
I did know that. Did you know some of them are bigger than planets?
Jake's eyes went wide. Really?
They drove home discussing planetary science, Jake's questions tumbling out faster than Marcus could answer them. The boy's enthusiasm a reminder that wonder still existed in a world that often felt exhausted by its own complexity. Mrs. Rodriguez had left dinner prep on the counter, marinated chicken and vegetables ready for the grill. Marcus changed out of his work clothes and spent an hour in the backyard teaching Jake how to identify constellations while the charcoal heated. After dinner, homework. Jake struggled with long division, his frustration building until Marcus showed him a trick for visualizing the process. The boy's face lit up with comprehension, that moment of connection when confusion crystallized into understanding. It was the same satisfaction Marcus felt solving engineering problems, just applied to simpler mathematics. Bath time, story time, lights out at 2000. Marcus returned to the kitchen table and opened his laptop, reviewing notes from the day's work at Whitestone. He found 3 programs with testing protocols that concerned him. Not flagrant violations, but subtle erosions of safety margins dressed up in language about efficiency and optimization. He drafted emails to the relevant program managers requesting detailed documentation and scheduling review meetings. His phone buzzed. A message from Admiral Chen. Contract finalized. Check your email for secure file transfer instructions. First deliverable due in 30 days. Marcus pulled up his email and found the classified transfer portal. He downloaded the initial briefing materials, technical specifications for the T-45 fleet audit, organizational charts showing Navy acquisition hierarchy, preliminary findings from the investigation into Whitestone's testing falsification. The scope was massive. 47 aircraft to audit, hundreds of components to verify, thousands of test results to cross-check against actual performance data. It would consume every evening hour he could spare, every weekend morning before Jake woke up, every fragment of time not dedicated to fatherhood or his job at Whitestone. Marcus had rebuilt his life around the principle that some promises couldn't be broken. He'd left the Navy to keep his promise to Rebecca that he'd raise their son with presence and intention. He'd taken a low-level job to keep his promise to Jake that stability mattered more than ambition. And now he was making a new promise to the pilots who trusted their lives to equipment built by companies who sometimes chose convenience over safety. It was a lot of promises, maybe too many for one person to keep. But Marcus had learned in the aftermath of loss that the only way to honor the dead was to protect the living. Rebecca was gone. The best he could do was make sure other families didn't experience the same sudden, senseless grief. He worked until midnight, took a shower, checked on Jake one final time, and fell into bed exhausted. Tomorrow would bring more program reviews, more emails, more meetings with engineers who'd been cutting corners so long they'd forgotten what the margins were for. The work would never be finished. There would always be another flaw to find, another disaster to prevent, another executive choosing quarterly earnings over long-term safety. But somewhere in the darkness over the Gulf of Mexico, 4 pilots were sleeping in their own beds because Marcus Sullivan had chosen to care when it would have been easier not to. That was the only measurement that mattered. The clock is never more important than the person it measures.
Some truths arrive disguised as terminations, forcing us to confront what we value when stripped of everything except character. Marcus Sullivan had been fired for being 7 minutes late to save his son's life. He'd been recalled by the Navy to save 4 strangers. And in the space between those 2 moments, he'd taught a CEO that integrity isn't about never making mistakes. It's about having the courage to fix them when the cost is highest. Catherine Price had built a career on ruthless efficiency. She'd measured success in stock prices and quarterly reports and the fear she instilled in subordinates. Then she'd fired a decorated military engineer for prioritizing his dying child over her deadline. And the universe had responded by showing her exactly who she'd discarded. The lesson had been expensive. 28% of shareholder value, $800 million in suspended contracts, and the kind of public humiliation that turned CEOs into cautionary tales. But it had also been necessary, because sometimes the only way to learn what matters is to lose everything that doesn't. Marcus returned to Whitestone not as an employee seeking redemption, but as a standard bearer demanding it from others. His presence in the executive suite was a daily reminder that competence without integrity was just polished corruption, that technical excellence meant nothing if deployed in service of shortcuts and lies. 3 months after the T-45 incident, Whitestone had transformed from a company racing toward profit margins into an organization that understood survival required trust. The change was imperfect, incomplete, resisted by managers who preferred the old metrics, but it was real, measured not in press releases or stock rebounds, but in the quiet accumulation of decisions that prioritized safety over convenience. And every afternoon at 15:15, Marcus Sullivan left his office to pick up his son from school, keeping the promise that mattered more than any contract or career or corporate resurrection. Because some commitments transcend professional obligation, rooted in love rather than duty, measured in presence rather than productivity. Jake Sullivan would grow up knowing his father chose him. Every single time the choice presented itself, without hesitation or regret, his father chose him. That was the legacy that mattered. Not the aircraft saved, or the investigations completed, or the policies reformed, but the simple daily act of showing up when it would have been easier to prioritize everything else. Marcus had lost his wife to circumstances beyond his control, but he'd kept his promise to her by raising their son with the kind of unwavering commitment that turned tragedy into purpose. And in doing so, he'd accidentally taught a CEO, a Navy admiral, and 4 grateful pilots that the measure of a person isn't found in titles or accolades, but in what they choose to protect when no one's watching. The fired maintenance technician had become the standard by which others would be judged, not because he sought the role, but because when the moment came to choose between what was easy and what was right, he'd never hesitated. Some people spend their entire lives searching for purpose. Marcus Sullivan had found his at 4 a.m. in a pediatric emergency room, holding his son's hand while machines measured the boy's breathing. Everything that came after, the rescue, the investigation, the job offer, the redemption, was just implementation detail. The only truth that mattered fit in a single sentence: a father keeps his promises.